Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Stephanie Smith with South Shore Clean Cities, and we are hosting this webinar in conjunction with our Northwestern Indiana Regional Planning Commission. And today we have Joe Exl, who will be talking about the Deep River-Portage Burns Waterway initiative. And if anybody has any questions during the presentation, please type them in the question box on your screen. And if you have any difficulties hearing us, please also type in the chat box and let us know if you're having any audio problems. And there will be a recording of this webinar that will be posted to our website, and you'll receive it after the webinar as well with the slides. So with that being said, take it away, Joe. Thanks for joining us.
To give you a brief overview of the Deep River-Portage Burns Waterway Initiative project. And in general, what the project is really about, the ultimate goal is to begin restoring and protecting the waterways of the watershed. And my screen is locked. There it goes. Okay. So not knowing exactly familiarity of my audience of what a watershed is, we have this diagram here showing basically whenever rain or snowmelt falls on the landscape within a particular area, there are going to be streams and waterways that runoff is going to flow into. Basically, in a nutshell, what a watershed is, it's the entire land area that drains to a particular point. So in this case here, for this watershed, for this river, this point right here, where my laser pointer is, that's its watershed. So any rainfall or snowmelt in that area is eventually going to wind up in these streams here and flow eventually to this point. That's very important to understand because any land use occurring within this watershed has a potential impact on water quality and the health of that stream. So our watershed at a glance, the project that we're looking at is obviously the Deep River-Portage Burns Waterway watershed. I know it's quite a mouthful. I wish I could do something to kind of shorten that up, but this map figure here shows the watershed. It covers approximately 180 square miles of northern Lake and Porter counties and eventually drains into Lake Michigan through Burns Waterway and the city of Portage. Within its boundaries, there are approximately 290 miles of stream and man-made ditches that drain the landscape. Some of its major tributaries include, obviously, the Little Calumet River up here to the north of the watershed, its main backbone, which is Deep River itself. We have Turkey Creek flowing into Deep River and also into Lake George, about the midsection of the watershed. And a little bit further to the south, we have Main Beaver Dam Ditch, which eventually empties into Deep River over in this area here. Now, within our watershed of interest, this is one of our most heavily populated areas within Northwest Indiana. Several communities fall within the watershed. These include the entirety of Hobart and also Maryville, but also includes portions of Portage, New Chicago, Ogden Dunes, Cherville, St. John, Winfield, Griffith, Crown Point, and even a little bit of Cedar Lake. So it's a very large drainage area. As I mentioned earlier, approximately 180 square miles. This map figure here shows the portions of the municipal boundaries that fall within the watershed itself. So why did we start the project? Why the initiative? As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, is this initiative is really about restoring and protecting the streams and rivers of our watershed. This map figure here that I have up in front of you now shows the impaired streams, or streams that are known to have water quality problems, meaning that their uses for swimming or fishing or their ability to meet state water quality standards are definitely threatened. By stream mile, our biggest issue within the watershed is what's known as impaired body communities. What that basically means is that fish and the macroinvertebrate communities, or the aquatic insects living in these streams, aren't as good as they should be, or in some cases we're finding out there are stretches of stream that have no fish even living in them. The conditions are so poor. So by stream mile, that's our biggest issue within the watershed. That's a little bit different than a water quality problem than most people are familiar with, like E. coli. Because impaired body communities, there can be so many different stresses potentially impacting those body communities. So, I mean, things like water chemistry can be impacting them, but you also have things like habitat degradation that can be impacting those body communities. Of course, we have E. coli issues within this watershed. So, you know, when we see those beach closures along our lakefront, those are typically going to be a result of E. coli or indication of fecal contamination within the waterway. We also have some concerns within the watershed and some of its streams with dissolved oxygen levels. That dissolved oxygen is obviously very important to supporting healthy and strong fish populations because, like us, they need oxygen to breathe. Dissolved oxygen is just the amount of oxygen dissolved into the water. But we also have issues with siltation or sediment in the bottoms of the stream. Now this figure here, the map showing our impaired reaches, this is based on the 2012 draft 303D list that the Indiana Department of Environmental Management has put together. I will let you all know now, and I'll go back into it a little bit later on here. What's showing up on the screen here, impaired water bodies, might be changing here in the next couple of years because IDEM is currently doing a water quality study in this watershed to support the development of this project and a watershed management plan. Next week I will be meeting with some of their staff down in Indianapolis, been invited down there to participate in their reassessment process, during which time they begin discussing, you know, which additional waterways should we consider listing as impaired and what are some of the potential causes. So what's shown up here on this figure probably is going to be changing within the next couple of years. All right, moving on to the next slide. So how do we address something as, you know, widespread and as a concern as all those impaired streams right there? What we're really talking about here is what's known as non-point source pollution or polluted runoff. That's our biggest concern right now within the watershed that's impacting those waterways. Non-point source pollution, polluted runoff, as I mentioned earlier, is generated when rainfall or snowmelt moves across the landscape and picks up harmful pollutants and delivers them to our waterways. How do we deal with something that complex? Well, we can use what's known as the watershed approach. Now, the watershed approach provides us a flexible framework to managing water resource issues, whether they are water quality, habitat, or even water volume. Watershed approach takes a geographically defined area, so I showed you the watershed boundary, that helps us put our limited resources to best use, not spreading it all over the place. It's very definitely a collaborative effort. No single individual is going to be able to make the changes necessary across that entire area on their own. I might be able to write a great watershed plan, but unless I get buy-in and understand what the concerns and issues are within the watershed based on discussion with project partners, it's just going to sit on the shelf. So, the watershed approach also takes a strategic approach to addressing those water quality issues. You know, we've defined geographically where our issues are. It's collaborative, and we start coming up with a strategy. Given these limited resources, what problems are we going to tackle first, in what areas, and what are the best approaches or practices to put on the ground to improve water quality and habitat? Now, to help us with that process, as part of the Deep River-Portage Burns Waterway initiative, we have developed a steering committee. The steering committee will be meeting officially for the first time here on May 13th. Over at NIRPC. I'll provide you with some more information about that here at the end of the presentation. But we have representation from various stakeholder groups, including municipalities, county and regional government or organizations, environmental and conservation organizations, recreational groups, business and industry, universities, and state and federal organizations. But obviously, too, there's also the opportunity for public involvement. We're holding at least quarterly public meetings during development of the Watershed Management Plan, which will take us approximately a year and a half to develop. That's a little bit more fast-tracked than what you typically would see with development of watershed management plans in our area. But with some prior work that we've done here over at NIRPC, planning-wise, we've been able to pull together quite a bit of information very early on, and I'm actually going to be presenting some of that here in the next few slides. Also, opportunities for public involvement. We're going to be developing and implementing an education and outreach program. That's going to be occurring throughout the life of the project. We received a grant, NIRPC did, to facilitate the development of the Watershed Management Plan, but also go into implementation. That project is over a 4-year period with the grant, and that education and outreach is going to be occurring during that entire period. Additionally, one of the components that I'm most excited about being a volunteer instructor for the Hoosier River Watch program is starting up a volunteer stream monitoring program and network within the watershed. This is going to provide an opportunity for, everyday citizens to go ahead and go out and monitor some of these stream sites for water quality, habitat purposes, and also the biology for Hoosier River Watch aquatic macroinvertebrates or aquatic insects to determine how healthy or unhealthy the stream is. The information gathered by the volunteer network, in addition to the information that the Indiana Department of Environmental Management is gathering for us now, will be used to help identify those critical areas, what the pollutants of concerns are, and based on that information, the steering committee and through other various forms of public input, we'll start to identify what the primary issues are, where our critical areas are, and what types of strategies are best for us locally to go ahead and implement to start improving water quality and aquatic habitats within those reaches. Once we start implementing some of those practices on the ground, that volunteer stream monitoring program, it's going to be pretty much going on throughout the year, minus winter, of course. That's not very conducive to a volunteer stream monitoring program. But the data that they're collecting out in the stream will help us evaluate how effective some of those implementation practices that we're getting on the ground are. We have to realize that is going to take a number of years to maybe see some of those effects, but the more data that we gather, the better information that we have, and we can make our program adjustments based on their findings. Okay. So as I mentioned, part of the project, we're going to be developing a watershed management plan. The slide that I have up right now is the Indiana Department of Environmental Management's Watershed Management Plan checklist. These are all the elements that need to be included within a state-approved plan. We received Section 319 funding to go ahead and get this project underway. And these are the components that are going to be included in the Watershed Management Plan. We just completed elements 1 through 3 here, 1 through 3, the Watershed Community Initiative, that really talks about, what our concerns are, who the stakeholder groups are, and representation on the steering committee. Currently, we're starting to work on this Watershed Inventory component. There's 12 different elements right here that need to be addressed. So this is a very intense study. However, it's time well spent because, given limited resources, people power, funding, and so forth, we want to make sure that we're making science-based decisions, complementing that with the public input, seeing which one of those concerns we can back up with data and which ones we can't. So maybe those go off to the side currently, and coming up with a strategy to start improving water quality and protecting it throughout the watershed. Here are some of the other additional steps. We're going to be identifying problems and causes. We're going to identify some of the potential sources and some of the what's known as pollutant loads, how much volume of a particular pollutant is going into the stream, what it is, excess sediment, nutrients, pathogens, things like that. As a group, we'll start to set goals and identify critical areas. then we'll start choosing what measures or best management practices need to be implemented to start resolving some of those situations that we're seeing within our streams. We'll develop an action register and schedule to make sure that, we're meeting certain tasks and moving forward and constantly making progress. And throughout this entire process, we're going to be tracking our effectiveness of the program. Okay. So we've had a total of 3 public meetings to date. 2 of them were definitely to gather kind of information from the general public, or why do they value the watershed and how do they use it, but also to identify some of the concerns. This slide I have up in front of you now is just showing some of the values that were highlighted by the public attending those events. Obviously, recreational opportunities, whether it's on Portage Lakefront, within Lake George, on Deep River itself. There's a lot of recreational opportunities within the watershed. There are some beautiful stretches within the watershed itself, forested areas, meandering streams, and so forth. So that was one of the values that were identified. Somebody pointed out, too, that Deep River is one of the few rivers left in northwest Indiana that still has large sections of natural meanders throughout its watercourse. It's really important to them. And, being trained as a fisheries biologist, I can understand habitat-wise, like, yes, having those natural meanders and different habitat types in there, that's important to the fishery. So that was important to the public. The watershed and its streams connect so many cities and so many communities throughout the watershed. A big one is that eventually the watershed drains to and affects potentially Lake Michigan. It does flow out there into one of our most highly visited parks along the Indiana shoreline, Lake Michigan right now. That would be Portage Lakefront and Riverwalk. Habitat, natural areas, and biodiversity, wildlife, and a number of other ones located off there to the right. So we had a nice, diverse group of stakeholders participating in the process, those public meetings. So, I think the values and comments that we received on values and their concerns reflect that. This next slide here shows just a few of the stakeholder concerns that were identified in general. We can go ahead and put those concerns into habitat-related, economic impacts, recreational impacts, planning and coordination amongst municipalities, communities, government organizations, businesses, and citizens. Of course, there was the general stormwater runoff, polluted runoff issues that were identified, drinking water concerns, and ubiquitous drainage concerns. It's hard to separate concerns about flooding and water quality, it seems, in some of these projects. So this slide is just showing just a few of the stakeholder concerns that were identified during those public meetings. And I would be remiss to, if I didn't point out that this isn't the first watershed planning effort within this area. Historically, one of our very first watershed plans developed here in Northwest Indiana occurred on Deep River and Turkey Creek. That was back in 2002. There's been significant changes in land use at the time, and even program-wise. It's not to say that there weren't accomplishments with the Deep River Turkey Creek Watershed Management Plan. There definitely were. However, many of the goals and actions that they identified in that watershed management plan are now tied back to a regulatory program that we have in place within the state, and that is the MS4 program for municipalities and urbanized areas. So municipal separate storm sewer system. Many of the strategies identified were related to that permit program, and you cannot use 319 funding or a number of federal program fundings to implement strategies or practices that are regulatory requirements. Also, within the northern reach of the watershed, our current watershed planning boundary area, we had a portion of the West Branch Little Calumet River Watershed Management Plan. A lot of great strategies, so forth in there. But unfortunately, it was one of those situations where, the plan was developed. I think there were some changes in directions and so forth on, how to move the plan forward. Some of the staff, in many of these cases, these processes, these plans can last as long as 4 years. Some of the key players sometimes change. Priorities change within our communities and organizations, so sometimes they just kind of fall to the wayside. However, with our current watershed planning effort, we're actually going to be bringing in information from both plans, incorporating it into this single comprehensive plan. There's some good information and good public involvement involved with both of those, so we're going to definitely incorporate those back into this new plan. Okay, so a bulk of the presentation I got today is on watershed characterization. I showed you the information on public concerns and so forth a few slides ago. What that's really going to help us do, that's going to help lock down kind of the framework and direction our communities, our citizens, the stakeholders want to move with this watershed management plan. We are going to do our best to tie some of those concerns and compare them to what field conditions, that watershed characterization, things that we're seeing on the ground out in the field, how many of their concerns can be tied back to what we're observing on the ground that can potentially impact water quality and aquatic habitats. And that's what this watershed characterization is really about. The goal here is, with watershed characterization, is to discover the true current conditions of the watershed and clearly identify a link between the stakeholder concerns and the watershed conditions. This particular slide right here is a stream located somewhere in the southwest portion, I believe, of the watershed. And, a stream shouldn't look like that. That's a whole bunch of duckweed and algae growing in the stream. Obviously, we have a nutrient concern within this particular area. Okay, so what are some of the things on the ground that can impact water quality? Well, it first starts off really at looking at surface geology. So when water runs off the land, surface geology is going to have an influence on, how much runoff is going to be generated, how much water is going to be infiltrated into the ground. And, in a way, too, this surface geology controls the topography and soil development within the watershed, which in turn influences water quality in streams, lakes, and eventually into groundwater. A large portion of the watershed, as you can see here, is clay loam and silt loam. So this light blue and this darker blue up here. What's really important about that is those types of conditions are very conducive to generating runoff. So we know we've got a challenge already just based on the surface geology and soil formation. This next slide shows the soil information and runoff potential. It's based on soil information gathered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS, their soils data. And it shows a rating system over here, starting at A and going down to D. In some cases, we have dual classes. But basically what this rating is starting off at A, these soils generally are very good at helping to infiltrate rain into the ground. However, as we go down the scale here, as it goes to that darker red from green to red, we have increased runoff potential. When we look into the southern portion of the watershed, basically the southern, I don't know, it's almost 3/4 or 2/3 of the watershed, we have high runoff potential based on these soils. The soil conditions here, yes, I mean, this tool was originally, the classification was developed for agricultural lands for like row crop production, bare soil, saturated, and so forth. But in general, it gives us a sense of how much potential there is for that runoff to be generated. This next slide here, so kind of related to the other one, this slide shows lands that would be considered highly erodible lands or soils. And this is a classification, once again, used by the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS, to identify land that is very susceptible to erosion for agricultural purposes. Now, to be eligible, for farmers to be eligible for USDA benefits that are producing annually tilled agricultural commodity crops such as corn and soybeans, they actually have to have approved conservation systems or a plan in place on these highly erodible lands to be eligible for those programs. However, overall, approximately 53% of the soils within the watershed kind of fall within this classification of highly erodible land. It's not quite as simple as just showing it on the map here. You have to have a certain percentage of that cropland for that parcel within or being classified as highly erodible. But once again, this kind of gives us an extent or a sense of like, wow, look how much of our land out there, if left bare, has the potential to run off into our receiving streams and water bodies. So we know that soil runoff potentially can be a big issue within this watershed. And I'll give you a hint. Right now, it definitely is. Just ask anybody living in the city of Hobart and along Lake George. Okay. This next slide here shows some more soils information, and in particular drainage class. Why is this important? For me, the reason I really wanted to kind of have an understanding on this is doing a little bit of research, looking at some of the literature that has been put out there by like some of the researchers at Purdue University. In essence, you can use soil drainage class information to identify where there is the likelihood of having field tile drains within our ag fields. That's important to know for a couple of reasons. One being that field tile drains actually help reduce the amount of surface soil runoff and some of the nutrients, in particular phosphorus, that's attached to the soil particles. It helps reduce that runoff to nearby water bodies. However, nitrogen, and in particular nitrate, moves very effectively through the ground, carried by water, and with that water, nitrates pass through the field tile drains and eventually into our streams. You know, nitrates happen to be one of our nutrients of concern in the watershed. So this kind of gives me a sense of, if I know where my ag land is, I know where the poorly drained soils are, chances are there's field tile drains in place here so that those ag producers can go ahead and grow that corn, that soybean effectively without drowning out the rootstock on those plants. All right, septic systems. Septic systems was identified as a concern in both previous watershed management plans. And looking at some of the soil conditions that are in place, our soils in this area generally are not very conducive to your typical septic system that relies on a gravity feed. That's kind of what this map here is showing. However, it's important to note that, you know, this is a very kind of like a large-scale, broad vision type map. The only one that can really make that determination is a soil scientist. So when a homeowner or business gets a permit, or is going for a permit to install a septic system, they have to have a soil scientist come out there and evaluate the site conditions for those soils, because they can vary significantly than, you know, what is just shown on this general map. But overall, there are definitely challenges with our soils in our area in regards to septic systems. We know that based on this, some of those challenges are going to wind up being that, you know, maintenance is going to be problematic at times as with its operation, and some of the systems to get them to work can be rather expensive as well. Okay, a little bit of information on hydrology. Obviously, the hydrology of our region has changed drastically over time. I can't remember exactly where I got this figure, but it shows some of the natural waterways, as it mentions right here, circa 1830. Now, historically, Little Calumet Galeen would have started over here in Little Calumet River would have started over here in LaPorte County, which currently is the site for its headwaters is Red Mill County Park, would have meandered slowly and sluggishly across Porter and Lake counties, flowed over into Illinois, the Calumet River, made a hairpin turn what is present-day Blue Island, made its way back into Lake County and emptied into Lake Michigan at the area what is now Marquette Lagoons. Historically, that would have been what has occurred. However, during the towards the turn of the century, early 1910, 1920s or so, many of these waterways were channelized, ditched, and modified to make room for development, whether it was for industry or for housing and businesses for those homeowners that were working in those areas. And this just shows some of those changes that have occurred and so forth with some of the divides that have happened. I mean, the Grand Cal is now basically a separate river system than the Little Calumet River. You know, for Portage Lakefront right here, Burns Ditch. You know, we have the East Branch now effectively separated from the West Branch, where it empties out into Burns Waterway out into Lake Michigan. Remember how I said in the previous slide that would have flowed this way, kind of around here and back out and out into Lake Michigan and Lake County. Basically, now we have an East and West Branch of the Little Calumet River. So significant modifications have been made to our local streams and waterways. A few of those other changes that have happened that have a potential impact on water quality, but also from a habitat standpoint, are dams located within the watershed. The one that most people are familiar with is the dam that forms Lake George in the city of Hobart. Once again, one of those structures that was installed around the turn of the century to power a grist mill, but also a drinking water supply for the growing city of Hobart. That dam is still in place. And another particular dam of interest here over the past couple of years is located up around Lake Station. This dam, also on Deep River, is fallen into disrepair over the past many years, I suppose, as it were. And, you know, there's some interesting possibilities with this dam. If there's a study currently looking, is it feasible to restore or remove the dam, and you know, how can that be done to not impact homeowners on the upstream side and the wetlands that are formed there, and is there a way to incorporate, you know, fish passage for movement of fish upstream and downstream of the site, and also recreational uses. There's increasing interest in developing a waterway trail from Lake Michigan all the way down through the Little Cal and up Deep River to Lake George, maybe a little bit further upstream of Lake George in the future. We'll see what winds up happening with that. So some interesting possibilities there. Regulated drains. One of the comments that was raised by the public, and one I definitely understand, is, you know, how do we find the common ground between, you know, being able to provide drainage to protect houses and farmland from flooding, but also do it in a way that is protective of water quality and aquatic habitats. This slide here, or this figure, is just showing some of the approximate locations of regulated drains within our watershed. This next slide, also related to hydrology, shows the amount of wetland loss that has occurred within the watershed. The areas of pink are where we currently have wetlands existing. Any of these kind of like baby blue or light blue colors in here, anywhere that shows up, it indicates areas of wetland loss. Now, that's based on what's known as hydric soils. Hydric soils are soils that developed under saturated conditions that would be conducive to growing plants that prefer to have their feet wet, and soils that are, you know, are going to be wet during a portion of the year. So basically, that's indicating where wetlands once likely existed. We've lost approximately 91, 92% of the wetlands within the watershed here. Why is that important? well, there seems to be that number at least. Why is that greater than 90% important? There seems to be some sort of threshold based on some of the information I've been able to find is once you lose more than 90% of your wetland area, things start to unravel very quickly as far as water quality and stream habitat for fish communities, macroinvertebrates, and the like. You're losing potential storage of floodwaters. So when you lose wetlands, you lose that, depending on where the wetland is located within the landscape. You're losing habitat for fish, potentially, if it's adjacent to the stream, for waterfowl and the like. But also, many of these wetlands had functional value of capturing sediment and nutrients that would have run into the streams otherwise into from the landscape surrounding them. So no longer are we getting that sediment trapping or that nutrient trapping abilities those wetlands functionally would have provided to help protect those streams and waterways. Now, obviously, when we're talking about non-point source pollution or polluted runoff, we're talking about human land uses here. This particular slide shows land cover information based on 2010. I've also added a layer on here showing where the impaired streams are in the highlighted in the red here. So the reason I did that is, we can see this area of red flowing through a brown area, which happens to indicate agriculture on this. But also notice is that we've got these impaired waterways flowing it through areas that are also urban. So this isn't just an agricultural issue. It's not just an urban issue. There's a little bit of every different type of land use there that appears to be having an impact on water quality, which is very much so typically the case with non-point source pollution. There's plenty enough, I wouldn't say blame, but there's plenty enough situations where we can all be helping make a difference by reducing some of our impacts and what we're doing on the ground that would be affecting the health of these waterways. Overall, in general, the watershed is very much so becoming more developed and urbanized. It represents about 45% of the land cover within the watershed. Agriculture is the second most dominant land cover type, representing about 28% of the land cover within the watershed. However, it is definitely a very shifting land use. This figure here shows development in agriculture, and dating back to 1985 and going through 2010, you can see this decreasing trend, pretty significant one in the amount of ag land and the conversion. Obviously, it's got to be converted to something. It's being converted over into development. So we're shifting from an agriculturally dominant landscape to one that is more developed. And the slide here shows development patterns over the past 20-plus years. The darker red shows the most recent development within the watershed. And a lot of that area, recent development has occurred around the Crown Point area and Maryville area, a little bit over here towards St. John. But in Winfield's just kind of really blossomed over the past several years. So that, potentially, depending on how development is done, can have an impact on stream habitats, upland habitats, but also water quality and water quantity. With that development comes impervious surface cover. Impervious surface cover is basically, you can think of it as things like rooftops, roadways, parking lots. Areas where, we lay this hard surface down on the ground that water can't infiltrate into. Why is that important? Because research has shown that once a subwatershed reaches a certain threshold of % impervious surface cover, things also start to unravel rather quickly from a water quality and aquatic habitat standpoint. This slide here shows the impervious surface cover kind of model thresholds. Anything below 10% streams, streams looking still pretty good. You might not notice too many water quality or aquatic habitat impacts below that percentage. However, once we start to get above 10%, many of those receiving streams start to becoming impacted by the amount of water that is entering those streams. Impervious surfaces, they're really good about, typically associated with them is you're going to have curb and gutter. We're going to get that water off the landscape as quickly as possible. Those pipes are often directed towards a stream or a water body. Streams didn't develop under those conditions naturally to receive that volume of water. They start to get unhappy. They try to find a happy medium, and what do they start to do? They start to erode to reduce some of that energy or that velocity of water that they're now having to carry. So that has an impact on water quality and also the aquatic habitats and the life that lives there. In general, what this slide is showing is that a lot of our smaller subwatersheds within our drainage area, our watershed, have been impacted by impervious surface cover. Okay, I've just got one slide here kind of going back and looking at some of the agricultural activities that might impact water quality, and that's the adoption or use of conservation tillage practices within the watershed. This information is presented by the State Department of Ag, and it's done on a county-wide basis. I've just brought it here into graphical representation. No-till seems to be no-till, meaning they're leaving a lot of crop residue on the ground, and that helps reduce erosion and the movement of soil particles off the field in the receiving water bodies. No-till is a lot more prevalent with soybean, and seems to be a lot more prevalent over here in Lake County than it is in Porter County. Once we get over to corn production, you can see that, no-till or conservation practices, tillage practices in general, over the past several years, I think we can see some potentially better numbers with that. Hopefully over time with the adoption of that, maybe it's a little bit of education and outreach, maybe it's additional funding to get the resources to do that. I'm not sure. That's why we're having some of these discussions now with developing the plan to try to figure out what are some of the factors that are contributing to these values that we're seeing here. The information is presented by county level. I'd love to be able to have that information in watershed, but watershed scale, but right now that information isn't available at that scale. Okay. Very early on in the presentation, I mentioned that Department of Environmental Management is doing some water quality work for us in support of the project. They are monitoring a total of 35 sites throughout the watershed for us with local input on where those sites are and what types of parameters they're taking a look at. For this project, they've been monitoring for a year time. It started last year. The water monitoring just finished up here this past month, and at these 35 sites, they looked at a number of things, including water chemistry, flow, habitat, fish, and macroinvertebrate communities. All that information being gathered to help us, develop this watershed management plan. But they're also going to be using that info to develop a total maximum daily load study. Basically what that study is going to tell them is how much pollutant can enter the water body and it still meet state water quality standards. They've created a project website for us, and that is available right here, this web address. Or if you'd like, you can use your search engine of choice. Usually if I do that, what I type in is IDEM, I-D-E-M, TMDL studies. You'll go to their TMDL web page, and you'll see current studies, and they've got a project web page for us where they've actually posted up some of the site photos, which I've got pointed out here. They've got a site map showing where the monitoring locations are, and not easy to read, but if you're interested, they've actually got the water quality data available there as well in Excel form. Okay. This slide here is just showing an example of how we might use the information within the watershed management plan. I went ahead and pulled some of the habitat assessment data that they have posted, and this is what I presented here. what it is showing is basically dots based on the different habitat scores. Ideally, what you would have from a habitat perspective to support a healthy warm water fishery is a minimum score of 51. 4 points is better, but kind of 51 is that threshold. Anything less than 51, the habitat is probably impacting the warm water fisheries and the aquatic life living there. In this case here, you can see where some of our better stations are, or better areas of habitat. In this case right here, like Site 14, that's a very good site that is actually located within Deep River County Park. Beautiful forested area, helping protect the waterway there. A lot of wetlands still present, floodplains intact. It's not being encroached upon by development or agricultural lands over in this area. We start moving over into some of these areas down here, and obviously like on Main Beaver Dam Ditch and some of its tributaries, you were seeing areas where we have habitat scores of like 25 to 33. Obviously, that's not good, and it happens to correspond with areas that we know there are no fish currently living within the waterway. So habitat is one of the concerns over there, not just the water chemistry or water quality itself. Habitat degradation is going to be a factor with some of the issues that we're seeing within the watershed. Okay, this slide here is a little bit busy, but it's just another kind of way to look at the data. I mentioned that's minimum score 51. That's what the red line represents right here. These numbers on the bottom are based on the sites. These are the QHEI scores. Now the habitat, the QHEI, that stands for Quantitative Habitat Evaluation Index. It's an index of several stream factors or important habitat types that the assessment crews look at to evaluate how healthy is the stream from a habitat standpoint. Things they consider is the stream substrate, in-stream cover, its channel morphology, the adjacent riparian land use, the condition of the pools and the water flows, the currents through there, riffle and run habitat, and stream gradient. Not too much you can do about stream gradient. It is what it is, but these other ones here can definitely be impacted quite heavily by people. And I've got these stacked charts up here, and let's go ahead and let's take a look at substrate. You know, sites that are scoring generally well are getting close to this minimum of 50. Substrate looks pretty good. You know, over here we're getting like values of 11 and 13 and 11. However, we go to sites where it's like, whoa, what is going on? You know, I'm only getting a total score of like a 25 or 30. Take a look at the substrate scores right there. Basically it's showing that the substrate is not conducive to supporting fish and aquatic insects in those areas. In many cases, it could be like a silty bottom, mucky, where the fish, there'd be no way they could lay eggs in there and have those eggs survive and hatch to, you know, become adult fish. So that's just one way we can use the data that the Indiana Department of Environmental Management is collecting for us now. Okay, only a few more slides left here. So this one of these last few slides here shows the project tasks and timeline overview. First year and a half is really going to be about developing this watershed management plan. We started on the project officially in January, and the watershed plan will be completed by June of next year. Throughout that process, we're going to be developing and implementing a education and outreach and public involvement program. As part of that, we have the volunteer stream monitoring program. Hopefully going to be getting that program started here in the next couple of weeks. Just recently submitted our quality assurance plan to Department of Environmental Management, which basically is just outlining we're going to follow these procedures to make sure that the data that we're collecting from the volunteers is as accurate and as good as possible. Once we've got the watershed management plan complete, this is what's to me, like where the rubber meets the road and what differentiates this plan from the previous plans is we were successful in obtaining implementation dollars, so getting projects on the ground physically to improve water quality. So I was very excited that we were awarded money from IDEM and EPA through the 319 program to start doing that, is implement a cost share program where we can match federal dollars with a local share, whether it's cash match or in-kind contribution, equipment, man-hour, hours donated, things like that, to get projects on the ground that lead to water quality improvements. Now, this cost share program and the 319 funding can only be utilized within areas identified as critical. So we're really honing in to where our biggest water quality issues are and where we want to expend those funds so we can get the best bang for our buck, as it were. That's where stakeholder involvement and the assistance of that steering committee is going to be instrumental. They're the ones that help evaluate and determine where the critical areas are and what types of practices we need to get on the ground. Okay, so one of the last slides here is one of the ones I show at the end of every Hoosier River Watch volunteer stream monitoring training workshop. Is never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Basically, we all live in a watershed, and we all have a potential impact on the health of our lakes and streams. So with that, I can open it up to questions or comments. I will point out this web address at the bottom of the page. If this information is going to be posted up later on, that would be great. My contact information here, jexl@nirpc.org, or you can check out the project website we've created on NIRPC webpage. You can actually sign up to receive an email distribution list. We're using Constant Contact to get things like meeting announcements, newsletters, upcoming events, to keep people apprised and up to date on what's happening with the project over the next few years. So I'll open it up to questions or comments.
Well, Joe, I had a quick question. With this project, obviously these streams don't just stop within Lake Porter and LaPorte County. Do you do any sort of collaboration with, our other surrounding MPOs or MACOG or anybody else in the area that, you kind of talk to each other on what you're working on?
Yeah, actually we do. We haven't done it per se with watershed plans, although, that's something that we're looking at a little bit later on in the future. So just to the west of Deep River-Portage Burns Waterway, there's the Plum Creek watershed that actually kind of starts over on the Illinois side. So, and we know we've got some water quality and habitat concerns over there. Would love to eventually get a watershed plan implementation program in place over there. So obviously that's going to be one that's going to require collaboration with the Illinois side. But we do work with them currently on some, like smaller level projects. Like, for instance, we've got the Lawn to Lake program. That's a bi-state effort, with Illinois and Indiana, us here. And the Lawn to Lake program is about how can we reduce our impacts to streams, primarily related to nutrient and pesticides from maintenance of our urban landscape, in particular landscaping with lawns when we're applying like fertilizer and so forth. What can we do to reduce those impacts to receiving water bodies? So that program right there happens to be like an example of a collaborative effort. And if you're interested in that program, you can find some info about it on the NIRPC website, or you can go ahead and look it up. It's lawn2greatlakes.org. That will take you to an Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant website where we provide information about the program. We've got a very nice manual in there that homeowners and businesses can kind of take a look at to, like, wow, what can I do to reduce my impact to the health of local streams and lakes. So, and we've even got a pledge there for those that like what they see and want to take a pledge. They can take they can pledge to reduce their impacts by reducing their use or eliminate their use of phosphorus-containing fertilizers and pesticides. So that's just one example.
Oh, sorry. And Jim is asking if you'll be notifying the public when you start looking for volunteers for the stream monitoring program.
Oh, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. One way to do it is to kind of go to the project website and make sure that you, or you can drop me an email, or the link that we have on the project website is to send an email to Meredith Stillwell. She can add you to the project email distribution list. We'll also be using other avenues to get the information out. You know, we try to submit information out there to on press releases. Sometimes that's picked up, sometimes it isn't. So, you know, then we start using like the social media avenue. We did just create a page for the Deep River-Portage Burns Waterway Initiative on Facebook. So we'll be posting information there. We'll get it out to the media through announcements and also through our email distribution list. So that's definitely, we're going to be letting people know when that's going to be started up, because we'll be doing training workshops. We'll work with those folks on, hey, here's some equipment you can go out and monitor. We've got these sites selected. Here's the equipment you can borrow, and here's how you submit the data. So definitely, we're going to be keeping people apprised of that.
How do you determine which locations will be monitored?
Basically, what we're going to wind up doing is utilizing some of the sites used by IDEM right now. We can always add some more, but this is kind of going to be our base point. The reason I'd like to go ahead and maintain some of these sites is because they've already got some water quality data. The more data that you have for a site, the better understanding of how a true representation that is of site conditions right there. And a number of these sites are fairly easy to get to. So we're going to try to capitalize on what they've got there. We might identify some additional sites to add a little bit later on once we kind of take a look at the water quality results that IDEM has collected. So let's say, for instance, here on the slide I've got up showing the sampling sites of, and this doesn't mean to pick on Winfield or anything like that, because I don't know if this is an issue or not. It's like, let's say this, you know, this point right here, they found an issue with like nutrients and pathogens. You know, maybe we want to set up a volunteer monitoring site a little bit further downstream at a couple road crossings to see how far upstream, or try to identify, all right, you know, can we kind of bracket a little bit better where the issue kind of is generally located, type thing, so that once again, you know, we have limited resources. Where can we best expend our effort?
Great. I don't see any other questions right now. I will be including all the links that Joe has in this webinar with the follow-up email that has the presentations and the slides, and this will also be on our YouTube page so that people can view the entire webinar. And if anybody has any questions, again, Joe's email and phone number will be in the follow-up email as well, so that you all can keep in touch. And I will send out Meredith's email as well, so you can email her to get on the distribution list for NIRPC. So, great. And I think one question just came in. Oh, nope, that was the same one. So, all right, Joe, thanks so much. Great webinar, and everybody have a great weekend.
All right, thank you, everybody.